Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody is doing well. Last show of August 2024. Unbelievable. We are down to the last 4 months of the year. Is that right? September, October, November, December. Yeah, we've got 4 months left. So we are continuing to cruise through. Summer is unfortunately almost done. I think kids are going back to school all over the world. And, for some folks, that is a huge relief. And for others, it's a new form of stress. But hope everybody's doing well. Today, we're going to dive into something. We get a chance to sort of dive in with a very interesting company today who's really kind of rethinking what remote access looks like, or, what modern VPNs look like. And I think it's an interesting topic to dig into, especially if you are in the security space, if you're in the networking space, but maybe more so, and we'll learn more about it today, if you're in the DevOps space, because as we're going to learn, your role in helping to manage, resources, whether it's people resources, access to applications and so forth, might be expanding quite a bit as, kind of the way that the VPNs and remote access are changing, especially as we've all gone through COVID the last couple of years. People are continuing to work remote. We have all sorts of, changes of where you're going to work. You might be in the office some days. You might be out of the office some days. The applications that you're interacting with, whether they are behind the firewall in your data center or out on the SaaS or out in the cloud somewhere, continue to sort of diversify and get, put in different places. So, especially if you're in the DevOps space, this is going to be a very interesting show for you. We're going to dive into how the role of DevOps is now very much interacting with the role of remote access, and maybe what we used to call VPNs, but we might now be calling them VPNs for too much longer, as they, their way of going about securing and access things is changing very, very rapidly. So really excited to dig into that after the break. Welcome back to the Cloudcast. I'm your host, Brian Gracely. And, folks, one of the things that if we go back a couple of years and we unfortunately think about what happened, everything with COVID and so forth, and how it changed how we work, where we work, the way we collaborate with everybody. So much changed from where we work. And not only that, but also so much changed in terms of the types of services that we were interacting with. We heard so many stories of companies that, were quickly trying to find a SaaS service or multiple other things aside from what they typically did, within their data center or just their normal way of doing work. And so much of that has changed how we have to think about security, how we have to think about access, where people work. And those things are still hugely in flux. And ultimately, it's now starting to make a number of companies really rethink their remote access strategy. So whether that's a VPN or something else. And we haven't really dug into that too much on the show recently. I think we all sort of lived with it, but we haven't really sort of thought about, well, what happened as a result of all this change? So very, very excited today to dig into that and kind of go into more depth on how that's changing. So very excited to have Emrul Islam, who's head of platform innovation at Twingate. Emrul, welcome to the show. Great to have you on.
Thank you very much. It's great to be on here.
We're going to dig into a lot of sort of how the technology's changed in this. Twingate is sort of right at the forefront of making people kind of rethink, do we even need VPNs? But before we dive into that, give us a little bit of your background, what you were doing pre-Twingate, and then really kind of where you focus today.
Yeah, sure. So I started in technology when I was pretty young, and I think my first career was a British company called Message Labs. So they started off in email security. Mm-hmm. Since then, I did a whole bunch of things. I did some AI, and I ended up at Twingate because I really like what they were doing. I've got to admit, I didn't fully understand what they were doing, and VPN technology wasn't that exciting to me in my career at that time. But once I took a second look at actually how they're doing it, it made a lot more sense, and it became a lot more exciting.
Yeah, it is. Well, and I can imagine, especially for what you guys do, and we're going to dive into it, you're really kind of rethinking the whole experience. So if you were coming from some sort of traditional VPN background, you're probably like, oh, another VPN company. And obviously you guys are doing it very differently. Let's sort of start with one of the kind of big complexities that people have with remote access is that it involves so many different teams, right? You've got you've got workers who just want to be productive. They just want their laptop or whatever to come up and work. You've got networking teams that are now like, okay, where are people? Where do we put policies? And then obviously you got security teams who have the ultimate concern. What are, at the most fundamental level, like what are the biggest challenges now that companies are facing? Because again, it's not just where people are, but it's also where applications reside. What are the dependencies? Like, kind of give us the big picture of what this new modern remote access is sort of looking at and the big problems they're facing.
Yeah, I'd love to. So if you look at, typically who would buy a VPN solution, you're looking at the network team or the IT team, depending on how big the organization is.
Right.
And their job is to look at the business and provide a bunch of technology solutions that meets business as usual requirements, right? So the management would say, we have some people on the road, or they need to access, the corporate file server when they're not in the office. And, dear Mr. IT person and network person, please provide us a solution.
Yep.
And those people would then go procure some kind of VPN hardware that was pretty much hardware when this all started. Mm-hmm. And that hardware would do the job. And that was pretty much as far as people went. Okay?
Right.
The world has changed a lot since those days.
Sure, absolutely.
And so the biggest issue is those hardware VPNs, they fall out of service more rapidly than customers would like. And the vendors are not then able to provide security patches for them. And then inevitably, security vulnerabilities are found. And suddenly you thought you had a very secure front door, and you realize that actually a lock can be picked pretty easily.
Yeah.
So that was just one issue, right? But another great issue is we don't live behind walled gardens. And the corporate infrastructure today is predominantly SaaS-based, and even on-prem companies will have a lot of SaaS footprint. Okay?
Right.
And if you're looking for a hardware VPN to protect you, you're not going to get that with the cloud vendors.
Sure.
Right?
Sure. Yeah, you can't get in their data center.
Yeah. And again, you speak to the network team and they'll give you a solution. They can set up a site to site and they can backhaul it and they can make it work, and they have made it work. But then as you layer on these modern challenges, things get slower, things get less secure. So if a remote salesperson needs to log in and access, say, Salesforce, mm-hmm. do you really want to be proxying that through what might be a pretty weak internal corporate network? And if you are proxying that, do you want that salesperson to then have access to all the engineering resources, because your firewall may not, your firewall and network VPN network may not support the segmentation? Right. So these challenges come in, and because VPNs have been a very lucrative target for attackers, the security teams have taken a more active interest in what the company is doing for remote access.
Sure. Okay? Absolutely. Yeah.
We're still talking technological issues. We're not talking, what happens if my laptop is stolen or something. But
sure.
What do you do as a security professional when you look at this estate that you have? Well, the first thing you do is you say, well, if someone breaks into this, or if someone gets into one of these systems, then the cost to the business could be quite high. You might find that, that compromise, and we've seen it in the public sector where I live in the UK, a compromise of a health network took down millions of computers that were used by the health service.
Right.
Those are serious issues. And the security teams nowadays have to come along and explain to management there is a cost of these attacks, and the cost could be X.
Sure.
So what are you willing to invest to prevent that compromise happening?
Yep.
Right? Because in any case of a cyber attack or outage, the cost of remediating is always high. Just not even the reputational cost, just the time it takes to get back online and clean your systems.
Right. Sure.
So as the security teams have taken a more active interest, and they've been agreeing, what the company or organization needs to do to prevent these attacks, the network teams have still had their requirements. They've still got to make sure, your IP address is mapped to your resources and all of that stuff they were doing before. But now the whole landscape is a lot more complicated because you have a mixture of requirements. You have your network engineers that need to fulfill some, say, routing obligations, and you have your security team that need to meet some obligations that they have to protect the users and the resources. And so when we speak as a vendor like Twingate, we're talking to these modern companies, and we are very often talking to multiple stakeholders with different sets of requirements.
Sure.
And trying to please a lot of, no other way to say it, but chefs in the kitchen.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. No, and I think probably more than anything, you're summarizing, kind of the challenge that we have with almost every new technology right now is that the expectation is more flexibility for the end users. In this case, it's end users. It could be developers, whatever it might be. The topologies have changed quite a bit, right? We're using a mix of internal and external services, and then ultimately everybody wants things to go faster, right? So, in your case, it's, remediate the problem faster, or, add 50 new users because we just hired people. And those end up requiring a bunch of multiple teams to work together. And that, that as much as you mentioned, as much as the technology, creates some challenges, but it also probably creates some new opportunities to say, hey, if those are all the things at play, maybe the way that you did it before might not be the right, the right exact way of going about. It opens up doors to say, hey, you may want to look at, doing this in a new way because the problems they sound the same, but they're, technically different than they were before. So how much of what you're dealing with is, the thing that you just talked about, which is, kind of coordinating between teams, getting them to understand, kind of where security stops and networking starts. And then how much of it is, new technology, new ways of delivering those capabilities, right? From hardware to software, or from, those types of things. What's sort of the initial sort of split between those discussions?
Well, obviously being a vendor, we lead with technology,
sure,
right?
Sure.
Rightly or wrongly, that's what we do.
Yeah.
And at Twingate, we can say, well, our technology does this and that, all sorts of fancy stuff. Mm-hmm. But very often, the prospects or customers that we speak to will turn around and say, well, I want a certificate here, or I want a firewall there. And do you support this certificate and this firewall? And we sort of have to look at them and say, well, we don't support that because we do it fundamentally a different way.
Okay.
So then the challenge becomes you have to convince the security person to park their preconceptions about how they think a security solution should work and take a look at the one we're proposing with a fresh set of eyes.
Right. And those are always the ones in which, like you said, your instinct is to say, let me tell you about all the technologies we have. And sometimes you have to almost boil it down to, let me take one pain point that I guarantee you have, say, with hardware-based things, and let me show you what that new world looks like. And then you can kind of open a door to say, okay, no, let me show you what else comes behind that first door type of thing.
That's exactly what we have to do.
Yeah.
And when we talk to, for example, networking people, even though we're selling a remote access solution, mm-hmm. It is pretty common that we find they're facing a number of other challenges. Like we support things like DNS routing, handling IP conflicts, issues that are not typically solved by a VPN platform.
Right.
But when we explain that we can handle these cases, they look at our solution a bit differently.
Sure.
Because it's something they wouldn't have imagined a remote access solution solving for them.
Right. It was on the other side of a demarcation before.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But then as you open up these doors, what we inadvertently do is get them thinking about re-architecting the way they're doing stuff, which is great. But re-architecting takes time. Mm-hmm. And so that does inevitably slow things down. And so our role in that place is to keep all of the stakeholders as aligned as possible.
Sure.
Right. So we don't really want the network team running away with us having one feature that really suits them, when the security team aren't really on board with certain other things. We need to keep them all moving at the same pace and in the same direction.
Right. Well, and I can imagine there are lots of scenarios if you just if you're working on technologies and you say, well, this will make people more productive. It'll be 20% faster. Like sometimes those are hard to grasp. I think in your world, like you said, the possibility, or unfortunately in some cases, like the reality of an attack, a hack, an outage or something, is always sort of lingering over people. So you can constantly kind of remind them or kind of realign them to like, hey, this is the real reality we're dealing with, right? That older way of doing things kind of got us in the situation you are. When you start to talk about sort of re-architecting or kind of rethinking the architectures, what are some of the core things that Twingate's been doing differently that is not only differentiated and unique, but you have to really kind of help people wrap their head around?
Yeah. So the first one I remember when I joined Twingate came up all the time is how many POPs do we have? POPs being points of presence. Mm-hmm. And VPN vendors were measured by how fast their backhaul was, right? Because they were routing all of the traffic through their pipes, and therefore that was a deciding factor in which vendor you would select. The issue we had and still have is we don't have any POPs. We don't run any because we run a peer-to-peer based architecture where we connect the users to the resources directly, and that means we don't need to maintain POPs, right?
Right.
Explaining that technological change, whilst sort of really simple and easy to understand, it made a lot of initial prospects kind of pause because they didn't know how to evaluate us. They've got a selection sheet, they know the answer from a bunch of different vendors, and they don't have an answer for us. So do they mark us down for that? Or what exactly do they rate us for that?
Right, sure.
So that was a purely technological example. And it illustrates the point. But then it got more sophisticated after that when we started introducing tools like support for Pulumi and Terraform. We saw that our customers were increasingly automating more of their infrastructure, and they were telling us in some cases they have it all version controlled, they don't have any manual intervention at all. If they want to change something, they change it in a Git repository and then someone approves it, and that is their new infrastructure. Okay? That's beautiful in that it gives you an audit trail. It means that a rogue network admin couldn't just change security keys or virtual machines, whatever they want. But the VPN software didn't support it. So you can change all of the architecture that your infrastructure is, but if you can't change the people that can access it, then you're blocked. Right? And so we observed this. I think we were one of the earliest vendors to observe something like that. And we added support for things like Terraform and later Pulumi. And we have an API. This API gives us a great advantage because we can tell customers, hey, if you provision a new virtual machine in your GCP, you can automatically give access to, say, your DBA, whatever is required. And that can be defined in code, it can be audited, it can be verified, and then you're not dealing with the issue of why does someone have access when they shouldn't, or why doesn't have someone access when they should. You can go to the source of truth. But selling that, again, was an interesting challenge because whilst the prospects that had been early adopters of infrastructure as code really jumped on it and helped us win a few great deals, a lot of the customers we were talking to were still experimenting with this new way of IAC. Right. And so they're experimenting with this this technology that they think is cool. And again, some unrelated technology vendor selling them on a remote access solution or a VPN replacement is saying, well, we can tie in with that.
Yeah.
Again, different stakeholders, the DevOps team, who are not usually party to VPN discussions, are now having to evaluate how well we meet their requirements, as well as how well we meet the requirements of security.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. It's, we've talked in this show for a long time about how, this intersection between essentially, the application teams and the infrastructure teams has gone through the transformation of figuring out, where does DevOps come into play? Where does infrastructure as code come into play? And you're really just elaborating and highlighting that VPN to a certain extent now sort of just looks like an application, and the things that you do around that, or at least the sort of best practices for the companies and the groups that move the fastest, are the same things that they do for, submitting code, having audit trails, using Git, all those types of things. But it is oftentimes an interesting kind of wake up call when you go talk to the network teams, because you don't realize, or you don't assume, oh wait, they haven't been keeping up with this technology for 10 plus years, right? Like they didn't learn Linux, they didn't learn scripting, they didn't learn, they're not used to using APIs, they're used to using the built-in sort of capabilities of a Palo Alto or a Cisco or Juniper or whatever. So yeah, no, there can definitely be, I can imagine some eye-opening things when you show them what's possible. And at the same time, people kind of going, wait a second, that used to be my task. And now you've built it into a workflow that does things end to end. Hold on, hold on a second, walk me through that. So yeah, I can imagine, again, you've sort of highlighted the intersection of technology changing team interaction and how do you get all those things going in the same direction? What, as you're seeing that sort of play out, whether you're dealing with the most technologically advanced or, just sort of, somebody who's been doing their thing for a long time, what are some of the big hurdles that, what are some of the big hurdles that you have to overcome, but more importantly, like, how do you help them overcome those hurdles? Because I think at the end of the day, you probably can go, hey, if I show you the end, right? Like if it was a cooking show, if I just show you the cake at the end, you're going to want that. But you probably have to show them, all the steps to getting to that great end result.
Yeah. I think the biggest challenge is actually recognizing things from the customer perspective. Mm-hmm. So I mentioned at the beginning of the call, I've worked in cybersecurity for a while. And one of the things that makes me cringe every time is every vendor is out there screaming risk, 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 danger,
Sure.
danger, danger. You have to buy our tool to protect yourself. Well, this kind of fear-based selling, it doesn't really work very well in the long term, because your customers, prospects will become desensitized to it because all your other vendors are doing the same.
Absolutely.
Right? And now, if you're someone who doesn't, you understand cybersecurity is important, you understand the consequences of getting it wrong, but you don't know every detail of your solutions that you need, you have no way to assess how one solution will protect you better or worse than another. And also, you don't know which combination of solutions you need to get adequate protection.
Yeah.
So you end up with some things. I mean, we've all seen CISOs that just buy every solution they can buy because they've got a budget.
Right.
And then a lot of those things don't get deployed. One metric we have at Twingate is to actually measure which of our customers are deploying our solution. And if they're not deploying, we sort of chat to them about it, because we really want them to benefit from the solution. If they just pay us and don't use it, we don't get any benefit, nor do they.
Right.
So we focus on metrics like that. And I think how you help a customer is by explaining to them, look, this is how other customers have done it in your industry or in your location. We see customers using solution A and solution B together. That's helped. So we talk in those terms, and we kind of guide them in the right place. There's a lot of documentation available now. Mm-hmm. It still requires a switched on or receptive administration team to go read all of that documentation, to test it out. That's the other big pain point. If you're a small organization, how do you test 5 or 6 different solutions? Because all of these solutions are pretty complicated sometimes, and they don't come with great documentation, which is another pain point and one we've worked hard to make sure we don't suffer from.
Yeah.
So it is a lot of hand-holding. And yeah, there's no straight answer to that.
Right.
But being honest with the customer, we've had customers that they don't have any cloud footprint, for example. Mm-hmm. And so we're just honest with them. We have nothing that we can protect for you. Okay, if you don't have any cloud footprint, there's nothing for us to protect.
Right. Right.
And that is kind of what it takes to help customers in this climate.
Yeah. I think. No. Well, and I think you highlight something that's really important is, like you said, there's so much of the security industry, for obvious reasons, that is constantly sort of harping on fear, because security is one of those things. It's a little bit like referees in a sporting match, right? Like if nothing goes wrong, you don't think they did anything, and then when something does go wrong, they become sort of the center of the discussion or the of anger. If you constantly tell people, like, you're at risk, and nobody can sort of point to the thing, at some point you become the thing that people go, well, do we even need that? And that's sort of the wrong side of the discussion you want to get into is people saying, well, we want to be less secure because I can't tell if we're actually doing anything. Therefore, we don't need 6 locks. We just need one, and just get a really big lock. And so, yeah, I can imagine that. It's not as if you're going, well, let's create some turmoil for you so that we can prove these things work. But at the same time, you also have to sort of educate them that, like, the odds are if you're in some high visibility business, government, banking, healthcare, anything that, bad guys want to get access to, you're probably getting attacked all the time, whether or not you make it visible to people, or, you put it in the headlines or not. And that's almost the other reality is you're not protecting against the one-off thing that's the headline, is you're protecting something like 24/7. And helping people understand that mindset is probably a tricky thing to do, especially if they don't, if you get into DevOps, they're like, well, I'm not thinking about security every day. I'm thinking about deploys and other stuff.
Yeah. Well,
yeah.
I was going to say that the big organizations, they can afford to have security teams.
Sure.
And those people are paid for 40 hours a week to think about security threats nonstop.
Yep.
Now, anyone smaller than those big organizations, which is the majority of companies, they still make billions, if not trillions of dollars in revenue combined. And hackers still see them as a juicy target because they might be easier. And if you can extract, a few $1 million with a lot more ease, then that's why hackers would go there. Yeah. So they have a bigger challenge. If you're a small or medium-sized business, you have a much bigger challenge because you can't afford to think about security all the time, and you can't afford to spend as much as the other people do. But it will be just as consequential to your business if you do suffer some kind of attack. And in all honesty, there's only so much you can do, right? So the best things, if you look at from the outside in, the easiest way to break into a network is by some form of social engineering, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So we have cybersecurity training. I think all companies now do that. Stay vigilant. That is something that doesn't cost very much, and probably in the grand scheme of things provides the highest level of protection. Okay, because if you have smart, switched-on people, they're going to be less susceptible.
Sure.
Okay? But even with that, there's certain technologies that will make your life easier, right? So there's certain EDR technologies that are not so intrusive. They're really great. Things like, obviously, I work for Twingate, but I really believe in the product. It makes setting up the administration of these remote access policies really, really simple. So if you're not someone who can do this all day long, you can get great visibility into how you set it up, is it what you want, and go from there.
Yeah. What do you find are sort of the best, I don't know, whether they're like example stories or, best practices that are easy to understand as you're sort of trying to bring together the DevOps team who, now sort of understands, hey, this is how you automate things, this is how you go fast, with these other teams that, think in terms of, attack, failure, block. Like, what are some of the best ways to kind of bring them together, or, find a common language between them, or, get them all, kind of understanding what each other does and why, you can move the whole thing forward, as opposed to, kind of like signaling out one group, oh, you're not needed anymore, or something along those lines.
I don't know what other vendors do, but what's been working for us is essentially focus on a group or a team that really understands what we're doing and really likes it. So, for example, the DevOps team might like our automation abilities, and they will start using it on their own initiative, basically. Yeah. And as it sort of works out well and they like it, they will then advocate internally, looping us in when we need to be. Yeah. But I think it's very critical that you solve one group's problem really, really well and in a compelling way, because if you take the approach that you're going to try and sell to every audience and convince them, it's an uphill struggle. At the end of the day, humans don't like to be convinced of things.
Sure.
And technology people have a above average level of skepticism, which I would say is healthy.
Sure.
So if you're trying to convince, an audience of 10 something and they don't want to be convinced, that's an uphill battle.
Yeah.
If you have someone who has a pain point and you're addressing that pain point and they evaluate you and they like that you've done that, then it becomes their job to convince their peers that actually this thing is worth looking at again.
Yeah. Yeah. One last question. I'll wrap up and let you go. Like, you were talking about sort of automating things, using the DevOps team as sort of the focal point for that. How much of security or how much of the remote access piece can be automated? Is it, do you find that most people are doing 20% and you can get them to 80 or 90%, or like, how do you think about that? Because automation can be such a powerful thing, but most people don't really understand, how much is possible, especially when you start getting into modern tools and APIs and stuff.
Yeah. So I would say in the last 12 to 18 months, it's kind of exploded, the level of automation that's happening. The IDP vendors all have APIs. So whether you go to Okta, OneLogin, even Azure, Entra now, they all have APIs. And what we're seeing is our customers are leveraging those APIs for automatic onboarding, offboarding, when people change departments, when people come onto projects, group memberships change, and that membership change will be propagated to apps and other configuration downstream. They've started tying these things together from the user access point of view.
Okay.
And the DevOps teams have come along and they've hooked into that process to say, well, if we can provision access to things, maybe we can just hook in the creation of resources in the first place into the same workflow. So it's kind of coming together. There's a whole bunch of no-code, low-code kind of workflow building tools that are gaining popularity. We've seen a whole host of our customers use various ones, and they allow teams to build things like, Okta pipeline straight through to Pulumi scripts being run in certain trigger events. We're seeing some Slack automation.
Sure. Oh, yeah.
We have an open source automation tool of our own. It's completely free, and we've got customers using it. They will basically self-serve workflows to access groups and resources. So cool. It's becoming really popular, I would say. In terms of a percentage, to answer your question, you'll never get to 100% automation. That will make humans completely redundant. But I think we will probably get to 60, 70% automation. And that reduction in human error will probably be a huge positive.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And yeah, I think that last sort of example you're using, so, kind of just thinking about, okay, people are trying to access things, but then what are they trying to access? And in some cases it's going to be resources. So it makes sense why Terraform is there, or Pulumi's there, or other things are there. So no, it makes a ton of sense. Emrul, I'm going to kind of wrap up there. We could go into a ton of detail. I think the reality is when you're dealing with sort of things that involve a lot more detail to dive into, whiteboards and demonstrations and so forth. I'm gonna leave folks to follow up with you on that. What's the best way that you're finding people engage with Twingate, whether it's engaging with the team, engaging with the technology, or trials and so forth?
Well, we have a very active Reddit community, and we have a free version. I use the free version at home. I think all of my colleagues use it as well. We see that techies are using that themselves and learning the product. So the documentation is there, the Reddit community is there. People like to do things on their own initiative, and we're there to help them if they have questions. Of course, we'll be there to answer them.
Okay, awesome. And we'll get links to that in the show notes for folks that want to kind of follow up with that. So, well, listen, this has been great because, like I mentioned at the top of the show, we're seeing so many things that have changed over the last 3 or 4 years. In some cases, where people are working, the tools they're working with, and that just unfortunately, it makes things a little more complicated for central planning, but it does sort of fit into the way that we've seen applications starting to evolve, distributed applications, distributed teams. So it's good to be able to dig in with you as to how the access technologies and the security technologies are evolving with that as well. So thank you so much for the time. Thanks for spending some time educating us on that. And folks, with that, on behalf of Aaron and I want to thank Emrul for his time today. I want to thank you all for listening. I want to thank you all for telling a friend about the show and helping us grow the community. And with that, I'm going to wrap it up, and we'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.